Hey everyone, welcome back to Speak Up. Whether you're sipping your morning tea, walking through a quiet street, or just lying on the couch after a long day, we're honestly so glad you're here with us. If this is your first time listening, welcome to the show. And to all our regulars, thank you, truly, for showing up every week and being part of this growing community. Today, we're talking about something that's a little different from our usual fluency or speaking tips. We're going way back to where English actually came from. Like, have you ever really paused and asked yourself, who invented English? Why is it the way it is? Because here's what most people don't realize. English isn't just one language. It's a blend, a puzzle, a story told by people from all over history. And it wasn't made overnight. It was built slowly through invasions, migrations, kings, scribes, and even accidents.
And here's something even more surprising. The English we speak today didn't sound anything like this 1,000 years ago. In fact, if you went back in time and tried to say something as simple as good morning, most people wouldn't even understand you. Not because they were rude, but because what they spoke wasn't modern English at all. It was something called Old English. And believe me, it sounded completely different. Today, we're going to explore that transformation, how we went from a rough tribal language to what's now one of the most global languages in the world. And it wasn't just one big change. It was layers upon layers. Wars, royalty, religion, and even a printing press that froze spelling in strange ways. So stay with us because once you understand how English was truly invented, the language you're learning starts to feel more alive. Ready? Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's go way back. I mean, really back, to a time before English even existed. Before there were any spelling rules, weird silent letters, or grammar books. Picture ancient Britain. We're talking thousands of years ago. The people living there weren't speaking anything close to English. They were speaking Celtic languages, which sound almost magical now, completely different from what we know. And then came a major shift. The Romans arrived, and with them came Latin. But here's the interesting thing. Latin didn't just replace everything. It mostly stuck to the cities and the ruling classes. Out in the countryside, people still clung to their native Celtic tongues. So for a while, there was this strange mixture, tribal languages in the villages and Latin echoing through the stone streets of Roman towns.
Exactly, and that balance didn't last forever. Because around the 400s, the Roman Empire began to fall apart. Their armies left Britain, and suddenly everything changed. With the Romans gone, their cities weakened, and Latin began to fade. But the real turning point came next. New tribes from across the sea, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, started arriving. They were Germanic tribes from what is now modern Germany and Denmark. And they didn't just visit. They took over. They brought their own language with them, a rough, earthy, powerful language that would eventually become the foundation of English. That was the true beginning. Not polished, not poetic, just the raw bones of a new tongue starting to take shape.
What's fascinating is that the names of those tribes are still hiding in plain sight today. England, it actually comes from the Angles. The very name of the country is rooted in that invasion. And the language they spoke? It sounded nothing like what we speak now. But it laid the first layer, the ground floor, of what would become English. These tribes didn't just bring new words. They brought a new way of thinking, of describing the world, of communicating with one another. Slowly, their language started to push out what was left of the older Celtic ones. So while English wasn't born in one moment, this was its first real breath.
And what's really amazing is that this wasn't just a language change, it was a complete cultural transformation. These Germanic tribes didn't see themselves as conquerors at first. They settled, they farmed, they raised families, but with time, their words began to dominate. So if you've ever wondered why some English words feel a little rough around the edges, like strong or house or wife, that's where they came from. They're deeply rooted in those early Germanic tongues. This early version of English, often called Old English, was earthy, simple, and very real. But believe it or not,
that's just the beginning. What happened next would completely change the language all over again.
All right, so now that the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes had settled in, their language started to dominate. And what came out of that mix is what we now call Old English. It developed somewhere between 450 and 1100 AD. But here's the thing. Even though it's called English, you wouldn't recognize a word of it. I mean, imagine picking up a book in Old English. It would feel like a foreign language. The grammar was totally different, full of endings on words that told you whether something was the subject or the object. There were no standard spellings, no real punctuation, and pronunciation? Completely unfamiliar. It's wild to think that this language is the ancestor of what we're speaking right now, but you'd never know it just by hearing it.
And what's even crazier is how it sounded. If someone from the year 900 walked into this podcast and started speaking English, we probably wouldn't understand anything they said. Words were shaped by the speaker's region, and pronunciation was heavy, rough, and full of sounds we barely use anymore. And yet, this version of English is where it really started. This is where a lot of our strongest, simplest words come from, like man, house, fire, water, night. They all come from Old English. So even though it feels like a different language, it actually gave us the backbone of modern English, the core, the roots. Without it, English as we know it wouldn't even exist.
Exactly. It's like the DNA of English is hidden inside those old sounds and patterns. And even though we don't speak that way anymore, traces of Old English are still everywhere. In fact, if you've ever wondered why English can feel inconsistent, why some words follow strange rules while others don't, it's partly because those early rules were eventually layered over by new ones. And not all of them got replaced. Some just stuck. So we ended up with this mix of ancient structure and modern style. It's like the foundation of an old house, buried beneath all the renovations, but still holding everything up.
And that foundation is exactly why English can feel a little unpredictable sometimes. Old English was complex, not just in vocabulary, but in how it worked. There were different cases for nouns, genders for words, and word order wasn't always fixed. But over time, especially as more influences entered the language, a lot of that complexity started to fade. Still, even now, when you speak English, especially the short, simple words, you're echoing a language that people were using over 1,000 years ago. And as we'll see in the next part, English was just getting started because something huge was about to happen, something that would completely shake the language all over again.
So up until now, we've been talking about Old English, the strong, raw language brought by the Germanic tribes. But then, in 1066, everything flipped. That year, something happened that completely changed the future of the English language, the Norman Conquest. William the Conqueror, from Normandy in northern France, invaded England and became its new king. And he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought a new language, a new court, and a whole new culture. Suddenly, French became the language of power. If you were part of the government, the church, or the royal court, you spoke French. English was pushed down, almost like it didn't matter anymore. It became the language of peasants, farmers, and everyday people. And that created this really strange situation. For almost 300 years, English and French existed side by side, but not equally. French was used in schools, in laws, in business. English was what people spoke at home or in the fields. But here's where it gets interesting. The two languages didn't stay separate. Over time, they began to blend. Words from French started slipping into English sentences. Suddenly, there were two words for the same thing, one used by the rich, one used by the poor. That's why we have cow from the farmers and beef from the French-speaking nobles. Same animal, two words. This mixing added layers to the language and made it richer, but also a lot more confusing.
And that's still true, even now. English became this strange, wonderful mix of two worlds. One earthy, one refined. And that contrast is everywhere. It's why we say freedom and liberty, ask and inquire, kingly and royal. Sometimes we even use both, not knowing they came from totally different roots. But that's what makes English so unique. After the Norman Conquest, English wasn't just a language for one group of people anymore. It became a language of layers, of class, of culture, of conflict. And the blending didn't stop there, because after a few centuries of mixing and shifting, something new was born, a whole new version of English was about to take over.
So after centuries of French influence, something strange started happening. English didn't disappear, it adapted. By the time we get into the Middle English period, which ran roughly from the 1100s to the 1400s, the language had changed so much it was almost unrecognizable from Old English. But here's the interesting part. People didn't plan this version. It just happened, naturally, through daily use. And what made Middle English so different wasn't just new vocabulary, it was how the language started to simplify. Old English had all these complicated word endings to show meaning, but now those endings began to fade. Instead of using endings, people started relying more on word order to make sense of sentences. It made things clearer in some ways, but also created more room for flexibility and confusion.
Exactly. And on top of that, English was being flooded with new words, not just from French, but also from Latin, especially through the church and education, and even from Old Norse, thanks to earlier Viking invasions. So suddenly, you had 3 different languages feeding into one. And imagine being a speaker during that time. The vocabulary was expanding fast, the grammar rules were changing, and there were no standardized spellings. People spelled things however they thought they sounded. It was like the language was being rebuilt, not by scholars, but by farmers, poets, merchants, and scribes, each adding their own touch. And while that made English incredibly rich and expressive, it also made it a little unstable.
And that instability is exactly what gives Middle English its charm and its challenge. If you've ever read a few lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you know what I mean. It's sort of familiar, but also not. You can recognize pieces of it, but the spellings are wild, the grammar feels off, and the pronunciation completely different. But even with all that messiness, this was a crucial time for English. It was no longer just a local farm language. It was becoming the voice of stories, religion, laws, and everyday life. And even though it lacked structure, it had energy. You could bend it, twist it, play with it. It wasn't frozen yet. It was still becoming something.
That's what makes Middle English such an important turning point. It was flexible, almost like clay. It was constantly shifting, influenced by every contact, every culture, every voice that touched it. But that flexibility came at a price. It made the language harder to pin down. There were no strict grammar books, no rules everyone agreed on. So while it gave people more freedom to express themselves, it also created a kind of chaos. But honestly, that chaos was necessary because out of that mix, all that borrowing, simplifying, and reshaping, the next big stage of English would finally emerge, and this time, something huge was about to lock things in place for good.
All right, so English had already been through waves of change, but then something massive happened, and no one planned it. It wasn't a king's order or a law passed in Parliament. It was something called the Great Vowel Shift, and it completely changed the way English sounded. It started around the 1400s and went on for a couple of centuries. Basically, the pronunciation of many long vowels just shifted upward. Words like bite, meat, house, they all sounded very different before this change, and no one really knows why it happened. Maybe it was social changes, maybe migration, but suddenly the way people spoke began to change drastically, while the spellings often stayed the same. And that's part of why English spelling feels so strange today. It froze during this big pronunciation shift.
And speaking of freezing things, this is where the printing press comes in. Around 1476, a man named William Caxton introduced the printing press to England. And with that, the written words started to become more consistent. Books, pamphlets, even religious texts were being printed in large numbers. That meant people started seeing English in print, and those printed spellings stuck. Even if pronunciation kept changing, the way words were spelled didn't. That's why we still spell night with a K, even though we don't pronounce it. The printing press helped standardize English, but it also locked in some really odd spellings and outdated rules. It made things clearer in one way, but kind of confusing in another.
Still, it gave English something it never had before: consistency.
But just as the printing press was shaping the language inside England, something else was happening outside. England was expanding through exploration, trade, and colonization. And as English ships sailed to different parts of the world, they didn't just bring spices or goods, they brought the language. And that language kept absorbing. From India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from America, English kept picking up new words, ideas, and expressions. It didn't stay pure. It didn't even try to. That's part of what makes English so unusual. It's like a sponge. Wherever it goes, it grabs onto what it finds and brings it back. This is when English truly became global.
And the result of that global journey? Dialects, regional phrases, and completely new ways of using English. The English spoken in London is not the same as the one spoken in New York or in Sydney or in Nairobi. Each region shaped the language into something local, something personal. New accents formed, new slang developed, and different communities started using English to reflect their reality. And what's beautiful about that is that even today, English isn't finished. It's still growing, still evolving, shaped by culture, technology, and everyday life. But that explosion of local voices, that's what gave English the depth it has now. Not just one voice, but millions, all speaking the same language in their own unique way.
You know, after everything we've explored, from ancient tribes to printing presses to empire, you might think English has finally settled down. But the truth is, it's still changing every single day. We're living through a time when the language is shifting right in front of us. Think about how we speak online. New words pop up constantly, like ghosting, FOMO, DM, vibe. We shorten words, we blend them, we even turn emojis into part of how we express ourselves. None of this would have made sense 50 years ago. And honestly, some of it won't even last another 10. English is in motion, always adjusting to keep up with how people live, connect, and communicate in the moment.
And this isn't just happening in one place. It's happening everywhere. English has become a global language, but not because everyone speaks it the same way. In fact, the opposite. English now belongs to millions of people across different countries, cultures, and communities. From business meetings in Tokyo to WhatsApp chats in Nairobi to classrooms in Berlin, English takes on different flavors depending on where it's being spoken. And that's kind of beautiful, isn't it? It's no longer about speaking perfect English. It's about making it work for your world, your ideas, your voice. That's what gives English its real power, not perfection, but adaptability.
And that adaptability, it's what makes English feel alive. It's constantly evolving, sometimes slowly, sometimes overnight. A new app comes out and suddenly we're all saying scroll, swipe, stream. A meme catches on and a new phrase is born. It's like English has become this living, breathing thing that reacts to whatever we throw at it. And yeah, that can be frustrating when you're trying to learn it. The rules seem to bend, the exceptions seem endless, but it also means this language will never go stale. It's always being reinvented, not by experts in a room, but by people like you who use it every day.
So if you've ever felt like you're still figuring English out, guess what? We all are, even native speakers, because the English we know today isn't finished. It's not a final version. It's just the current version, a snapshot in a much bigger story that's still being written. The words you say today might be different tomorrow, and that's the wild part. The English you're learning, struggling with, improving, it's not stuck. It's still becoming something new. And somehow, you're now part of that story too. Okay, Ryan, before we go, if you had to answer this in just one sentence, what's the biggest reason English became the way it is today?
I'd say because it never tried to stay the same. It kept borrowing, bending, and evolving with the people who used it.
That's such a great way to put it. And to everyone listening, whether you're just starting to learn English or you've been on this journey for a while, just know this. The language is still changing and you are part of its future. Thanks for spending this time with us today.